Speaker Series. Thank you all for attending this session. The Global Leadership Speaker Series is an initiative from the Center for Global Partnerships and Learning and the Associated Dean's Office. This event focused on a myriad of topics that impacted leadership in a global space, and events were held from April to June. Before we start, I'd like to share some information about our center. The Center for Global Partnerships and Learning provides GSEP students with various services ranging from publication support, certificate programs, access to GSEP Academic Journal, our Scholarship Without Borders, and a few other services such as cultural celebrations, info sessions, and workshops. Now, let me introduce you to our guest speaker for the day, Dr. Natasha Brown. She's a Senior Director of Business Strategy and Learning Innovation at Microsoft Corporation, Adjunct Professor, Master of Public Administration Graduate Program at the California State University, Northridge. So Dr. Natasha Brown is a transformation and organizational development industry expert and a scholar with a deep experience leading enterprise strategy and change management. She currently heads a global team of learning and development professionals at Microsoft Corporation, creating content and modernizing learning experiences to build the world's most innovative sales organization. She previously led the Microsoft US Area Transformation Office, driving a strategic transformation, supporting change management for the region, and engaging with Microsoft customers to support their learning journeys around transformation, leadership, and hybrid work. Dr. Brown also currently serves as an adjunct professor at the California State University, Northridge, in the Master of Public Administration program in the same college for graduate, international, and mid-career education, where she teaches organizational theory and human behavior on organizational leadership. Additionally, she is a board trustee of World Oregon, a nonprofit dedicated to deepening public awareness and understanding of international affairs. Dr. Brown has also been named program co-chair for this year's annual International Leadership Association Conference, Cultivating Leadership for a Thriving Future, which marks the association of the 25th anniversary. Dr. Brown's PhD in Global Leadership and Change from Pepperdine University follows a Master in International Relations from Yale University and a Bachelor in Political Science from Occidental College. She also studies as Fulbright Fellow at the University of Helsinki in Finland. Her research on post-pandemic global leadership is published in the Springer volume Leadership After COVID-19, Working Together Towards a Sustainable Future. And her chapter on post-pandemic servant leadership is now available in print in the Palgrave Handbook of Servant Leadership. So today, Dr. Brown will guide us through a reflection on self-awareness and effective leadership. Dr. Brown, thank you so much for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you so much, Sue Ellen. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today. Thank you, Dr. Gabi Miramontes. Thank you to Dr. June Schmieder Ramirez, Dr. Farzeen Majidi, and of course, thank you to Dr. Maria Brame. Thank you for inviting me today. And Maria, thank you for teaching me how to do research and also for teaching me how to get published. I'm always grateful for you. And I'm so glad to be here and be connected again. Thank you also to all the students here live and watching the recording. I hope this can be an interactive conversation, and I'm really glad that you're here. I appreciated the introduction. I'll also add that I've become a pickleball player, which is feeling pretty important to me this summer. So if you haven't tried it out, I want to encourage everyone to try a little pickleball this summer. I live in Oregon, so I divide my time between Portland and Central Oregon. Right now I'm in Central Oregon, and as I look out of the windows, we've got juniper trees and sage bushes, and how I only wish I had a pickleball court right outside. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, in hopes that someone could just let me know if you can see that blue screen. Yeah, okay, great. All right. So I've got a bit of an activity for us. I hope you could pull out a notebook or notes in your phone or OneNote, whatever you use, get that ready. I thought we'd start with an activity and close with an activity. And I've got some lecture for you in between on self-awareness and leader effectiveness. So want to set up some context for you. I'll talk through some literature, and I'm always building my list too. So I'll share my sources today, and if you've got others that you recommend on self-awareness, I would love to read those too. I will ground a little bit in the research that I did for my dissertation, and I'll share with you some of the work that I've been doing on a related topic post-dissertation. And then would love to resume our activity work, and then also I'll be sure to save time for Q&A and discussion at the end. Okay, so here's the activity part to get us going. We're going to talk about self-awareness today, and some themes that you'll notice is that self-awareness really comes from self-reflection and from feedback. And so I wanted to just start with some self-reflection. Now, you won't have to share this sheet with anyone, I promise. And I really want to invite you to participate. I've done this exercise myself. And so, but we'll look at some different concepts of self-awareness. Bill George, who he wrote Discover Your True North, there's a book, and then there's a field book, kind of a workbook that goes with it. He says self-awareness is the ability to see yourself clearly, to recognize and understand your moods, your emotions and drives, and the impact you have on others. So I want to invite you to do a bit of reflection, and I want to ask you to give yourself a self-rating. You can just jot this down somewhere. 1 to 5, 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. I want to invite you just quietly to ask yourself these questions and give yourself a score. How self-confident am I? How self-accepting am I? How comfortable am I with who I am? How aware am I of my moods, my emotions, and my drives? Lastly, how aware am I of the impact I have on other people? So I want to encourage you to give yourself a number for each. Go ahead and total them up. Oh, we're going to just give you another quiet minute to complete that. All right, so we've started our session on self-awareness with some self-reflection. I'll invite you to just set this aside for the moment. We're going to come back to this at the end. So today I want to talk about self-awareness. I'll share with you my journey and exploration of self-awareness and leader effectiveness. It really started with looking at self-awareness and global leadership. Continued into my dissertation work on authentic leadership in crisis, and has continued since then in some further exploration that I've been doing around the development of self-awareness and also leader effectiveness. So wanted to just start with a little bit of just touching on some of the literature, grounding in the literature. And these sources I started reading, it was actually in Dr. June's class that I took. So I finished my dissertation in 2021. I walked last summer in 2022. That was pretty fun. And so took Dr. June's advanced leadership theory class and decided at that time to focus on self-awareness. Little did I know that this kind of curiosity would hold my academic and research interests for so many years. And so some of the literature that I started to look at around self-awareness, and you might be familiar with some of this, and I would love if you put in chat or send my way otherwise other things that you have really enjoyed reading. But Goleman is important here. And so Goleman talks about self-awareness really as a critical component of EQ, or emotional intelligence. And so he talks about emotional self-awareness, kind of being accurate in your self-awareness, and the type of self-confidence that comes from self-worth. He also goes on to talk about blind spots, those things that we don't see about ourselves, but others do. And so for Goleman, identifying blind spots is really an important feature of self-awareness, but it's also a differentiator for leaders. So Bill George, and the exercise that I just shared with you comes from Bill George's Discover Your True North field book. And so George says that self-awareness is a really important element of authenticity. So interestingly, George says, knowing when leaders know themselves, that is when they're able to achieve their true potential. He also says that self-awareness is a combination of introspection and feedback. Introspection and feedback. So I'm going to keep coming back to this point. This is a pretty important one. And we got started on the first part of that equation in the activity, the self-reflection part. And then Cashman, I love this book. If you haven't encountered it yet, Leadership from the Inside Out. It's hard work, it's a journal, and it goes along with Cashman's theme, which is that self-awareness comes from a deep journey of self-reflection. Cashman is a big advocate for journaling as a way to get to that self-awareness. And then Mendenhall, great text on global leadership. And in the global leadership competencies, how interesting that self-awareness makes quite a showing here. So self-awareness is part of the continuous learning dimension of the intercultural effectiveness scale. It's part of the relationship management factor in the global competency inventory. And it shows up in the seeing the differences dimension of the Global Leadership Online Index. So there's just a few books that I wanted to flag for you. And also just a couple of points that I wanted to tease out for our conversation today from some of the peer-reviewed journals. So Mistifer, she says that developing self-awareness is an actual responsibility. And so she says that there's an imperative of leaders to develop self-awareness. And the way to go about this is through reflection and inquiry. Bratton, and that's actually Bratton et al. So they look at efficacy and performance. And they say that, interesting, they say leaders who underestimate their abilities perform better than leaders who overestimate their abilities. Pretty interesting. Then Higgs and Rowland, they really have a discussion about change management and change leadership. And what they say is that leaders who have blind spots, they're lacking self-awareness, they're more likely to fail when they're leading change. And so what they say is that self-awareness supports leaders in navigating change and supporting organizational change. Okay, couple more to ground in. Shori and Manasa, they really talk about manager and leader effectiveness. And so their point is that there's two components of self-awareness from their view. This will start to sound very familiar. There's an internal self-awareness, and there's they call it social self-awareness, which is how others see us. And they say both are important, and also that both enable manager and leader efficacy or effectiveness. Okay, last one here. That Caldwell and Hayes goes just, I'd say, even a step further beyond Mistifer with this moral obligation piece. So they say that self-awareness helps leaders be effective, that leaders have a duty. They even say a moral obligation. Leaders have a moral obligation to cultivate self-awareness, and they encourage leaders to do self-awareness building activities regularly. And those include things like evaluating assumptions, discerning their beliefs and ideas, understanding their values. And so they really propose that those activities should happen regularly. So there's just a little bit of an overview of the literature for you. And so in my own journey, got curious about self-awareness in my coursework. And then as I progressed to my dissertation phase, I expanded a little bit, and I got really fascinated by authentic leadership. And authentic leadership, of course, includes 4 components, and one of those is self-awareness. And so all the work that I had done all along on self-awareness really helped me understand more about authentic leadership. So I was able to put that coursework and the Dr. June assigned papers to good use. And so Avolio says that authentic leadership includes 4 parts: self-awareness, which we've talked about, balanced processing, and what that really means is collecting feedback and input from others before making a decision, ethical and moral behavior, and then transparency of information. And I pulled just a quote from Avolio. Authentic leadership is a pattern of transparent and ethical leader behavior. It encourages openness and sharing information needed to make decisions while accepting the input of followers. Okay, so I started my dissertation journey then, knowing that I wanted to focus on authentic leadership. And we were in this backdrop of COVID. So this was right smack in the middle of the pandemic. And so I really thought about, there was a lot going on, right? The coronavirus unleashed so many challenges in 2020. I had actually shifted my dissertation. Originally, I planned on studying post-M&A organizational culture. And then all of a sudden, the pandemic was upon us, and we saw political instability. We saw financial turmoil, a public health crisis, all kinds of new constraints, remote work environments, shifting consumer demand, supply chain disruptions. And what I thought to myself, at this moment in time, I can't not ground my study in the pandemic. And so I shifted, and you'll see on the right there, I have a background in business. I'm currently active in the corporate environment. So I had the backdrop of the study, the corporate landscape. I really wanted to lean into the social constructivist paradigm, which basically says that meaning is made and knowledge is created through the interaction of people. And then I had to find, what is the location of the study? I knew I wanted to look at authentic leadership. We're in COVID, so what does pandemic era leadership look like? And this is a time of crisis. And so what is crisis leadership? And most importantly, what is the intersection of the 3? And so that's the location of my study. And so this was, as Sue Ellen mentioned, and thank you, Sue Ellen, in the PhD program in Global Leadership and Change at GSEP. So I've been right there in that room where you are today. And so the research question that I asked was, to what extent, if any, does authentic leadership enable leaders to navigate crisis effectively? And so I did a qualitative study. This was a phenomenological research design. So I was looking at the lived experience of corporate executives. And so I did semi-structured interviews. All of the executives that I interviewed were in global Fortune 500 companies, and they were all in the top levels of their leadership. I'll just share a little bit more. So there were 11 11 companies. They were from a variety of regions around the world, a variety of business functions, and also a variety of industries from apparel and retail to chemical to technology. So I had quite a bit of diversity. These were all large companies. They're all global 500 companies. I interviewed them and I conducted my research, and the findings led us to something pretty interesting on self-awareness. So I had two key findings. I'll mention the first, but it's really the second that I want to lean into today. I talked about transparency and balance processing as elements of authentic leadership. What I learned in my research is that transparency and balance processing did help leaders navigate in crisis. In fact, all four of the components of authentic leadership did. But there was a unique paradox. Because of the constraints of the pandemic, transparency and balance processing were harder. There were new rules around what information could and couldn't be shared. Sometimes there was just plain misinformation or lack of knowing that made transparency difficult. In addition, it was hard for leaders to get lots of feedback and input before making a decision, because some decisions had to be made extremely quickly. Are we going to close our offices today? Well, what's our policy on vaccinations? There were so many decisions that needed to be made really quickly. Now, the second finding I want to lean into a little bit more, because this brings us back to self-awareness. Of all four components of authentic leadership, my study revealed that for these executives leading during the pandemic, self-awareness was by far the most important component in helping them navigate the crisis. Self-awareness helped them be effective leaders. It helped them lead. But that wasn't the only thing going on. And this was a finding that came through the research that I really couldn't have imagined before doing this study. And I guess that's what research is all about. So there was a pattern. If you think of a snowball that rolls and builds and builds and builds upon itself, this is what I discovered was going on. So self-awareness helps the leaders navigate in the crisis. And the act of navigating in crisis made them more self-aware. And then they were being more self-aware, they got even better at leading in crisis, and more crisis experience made them self-aware. And so I called this the snowball cycle of self-awareness in crisis. Really important for these leaders who are leading during COVID. And so after my dissertation, and I graduated, I completed my work, and I was still curious. I think I had really, as we do as researchers, we pour ourselves into our work. I used a software called MaxQDA. It's a qualitative analysis software. I'm happy during Q&A if there's any dissertation tips that I can share that are of interest. I'm happy to share them. I really liked MaxQDA. I had all my data in one place, and I was able to go back and look at it with new information, with new curiosities to re-examine all that I had gathered. And so in preparation for speaking at a conference and some work that I'm doing currently and preparing to do additional writing, and it's awfully fun to write and publish and speak at conferences, and I'm so grateful for all the support I had at Pepperdine and learning how to do those things. But I went back to the data, and the language of the participants, their actual words are so important. So I pulled a few quotes for you. I'm going to just zip it for a minute, and I'd like to invite you to read these. Yeah, so if you self-assess, maybe it's your approach. Self-awareness was one of the prime capabilities needed through the crisis. Self-awareness meant I don't have the answer. I allow myself to be vulnerable. If I have a strength, what part should I play more? What part should I change? And so I went back to really think about what are these themes of self-awareness telling us? And I wanted to just summarize a few for you. So something I learned from this study and the participants in it is that vulnerability helps a leader earn a mandate to lead. And these leaders shared so many stories of vulnerability, of the fears they had leading during COVID, the concerns, difficulty in the very quickly switching shift to remote work, sometimes navigating illness or support for their families. And they talked about how being vulnerable really helped them earn a mandate to lead. They also said that deep listening builds self-awareness. So in listening to others, they learned more about how they were perceived, what was needed to lead, what the finger on the pulse of the organization was. The leaders talked about how in COVID, especially at the start of the pandemic, there were many questions that leaders did not have answers to. And rather than make up an answer or pretend. Many of them opted to admit to not having the answer, and that was very self-aware, and that helped them to be more effective. They felt that they actually earned more of a mandate to lead when they admitted not knowing. These leaders also talked about the value in knowing themselves again, but knowing their strengths and knowing their weaknesses and being aware of both. Self-awareness. So ultimately, self-awareness can be developed. We can improve on our self-awareness, and self-awareness supports effective leadership. And that came through really clearly in this study. I will share, I did have some kind of recommendations coming out of this study. And one of them is that companies should really enable robust opportunities for getting feedback so that leaders can develop more self-awareness and be more effective. I also recommended that the core values of any organization really be emphasized. So if crisis develops, when push comes to shove, and we need our leaders to really align to ethical and moral behavior, we want to make sure that the core values are already ingrained. Another recommendation I had was to build a culture of intentional risk taking and innovation. If we can have a chance to fail, we can learn from that, and our leaders can develop more self-awareness and practice. We don't always have a safe environment or even environments that are unsafe to practice leading in crisis. But a last recommendation I had was to employ the use of simulations. So drills, simulations, scenarios that are constructed for leaders to practice leading in crisis, to help them generate that snowball cycle artificially, if you will, of leading in crisis, becoming more self-aware, getting better at leading in crisis, and then further becoming even more self-aware. So those were some of the recommendations that I had coming out of the study. And just want to emphasize that at the literature, the study, all of this work is pointing to the notion that self-awareness can be developed. To develop our self-awareness, we can self-reflection alone will only get us so far. And so we really need to rely on feedback to help us understand our blind spots. And so with that, I want us to revisit our activity. So you probably saw this coming. So I just want to encourage you, you won't need to share this with anyone. This is for you and your development. Pull out your sheet or your notebook or your phone. And I'd like to ask you to consider some homework. I want to invite you to consider taking some homework on. I have personally done this exercise, and it was really valuable to me. And so the exercise is this. So you've got your self-rating, you've got it totaled up. I want to invite you in the coming days or the coming week to complete the rest of this chart that comes from Bill George's book, Discover Your True North, and to do that by asking others for feedback. And so 3 others, perhaps, it could be more if you wish, people who know you well. Could they honestly rate you? And then once you have those, I want to encourage you to total up your ratings and look at what this story tells you. What are the averages across each question? What are the totals at the bottom? Are they the same? Are they different? What does that say about you? What does that say about your self-awareness? What opportunity do you have to develop further? I will disclose to you with vulnerability. I had 2 friends, close friends who know me well, do this exercise for me, and my husband, who probably knows me best. The 2 close friends had very similar ratings, but they were different than my own. My husband had gave me the lowest ratings of all. And I realized from that I had some work to do on improving my own self-awareness. In addition to the husband's rating, the close friends' ratings were different than mine. And so I realized that there were some blind spots. I wasn't personally as aware of the impact I have on other people as I thought I might. So these are just a few questions. I'm just sharing with you a little bit about my own personal learning. I'm really curious what lies within this simple exercise for you and how that might help you along your journey of self-awareness, leader development. Okay, so I'm getting ready to close this section. We'll move to Q&A and discussion shortly, but I did just want to show you a couple things. I'm happy to share my deck with Sue Ellen to give you access to it. Here are the references that I discussed. So I wanted to share these with you. I know as a researcher, it can be so important to find the research that is really critical to your question and your study. So I wanted to share these references with you. I also, and we'll come back to that in just a sec, I also published my dissertation with open access. So if you're interested in reading more about the dissertation study, this is available for free for you to have access to. And let's see, I tucked in a couple of more resources in this deck, a little bit of the study, and you're welcome to browse that. I will send that over to Sue Ellen. But why don't I stop sharing screen? And I am happy to take questions. I would love to hear reflections on the exercise. Anything that, if anyone would be willing to share what you learned in doing the self-assessment, we can have a discussion here together. So I'll turn it to you.
Dr. Brown, thank you so much for the great presentation. You did an amazing job in your research. I love that. I'm really intrigued by everything that you showed. About the assessment, I got curious. I need to send this for other people to evaluate and compare myself. If I have the right reading of myself or not. Well,
I encourage it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it was very nice that you showed you shared a little bit about your results and showed vulnerability. I have some questions for you. And of course, everyone in the audience, please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions or even post in the chat. So some of the questions some of the things that intrigued me in your research. One of the question is, for example, you said that in crisis, transparency and balancing processing was harder. So, and then you shifted more to awareness. So I'm curious to learn a little bit more if you had any ideas or cues on how to overcome this barrier?
Mhm.
Because it's very important, right?
Mhm. Absolutely. Thank you so much for the question. And so, in crisis by nature can strain a leader's ability to lead. And so I did a third of my dissertation literature review on crisis leadership. And so there's a lot of thinking around what makes leading in crisis so hard and what are some things to help overcome it. And so I would say it wasn't an unusual or an atypical finding that leaders found it difficult to be transparent in crisis, or that they found it difficult to collect opinions from other people before making a decision. The difference with COVID was that it was new, right? We had never experienced this before, and in this way, and so leaders within companies were needing to create policies that did where there were none, or interpret policies that didn't necessarily apply to the COVID pandemic and to that scenario, and so one thing that came up in the study, and then also it's in the literature on crisis leadership, is communication, just the real importance of clear communication. And so speed can be the challenge. But what some of the leaders talked about in their study that they did was call, more meetings, more communications, over communicating, get calling together all hands. Some leaders did daily stand-ups, so finding ways to get everyone in a room all at once, to be able to do some balance processing. On the transparency side, I did some of the executives in my study had all different kinds of C-suite roles, but I did have an opportunity to speak with leaders who were involved in information security, and also leaders in HR. And so they were very connected to policy, to legal aspects, and they talked about finding the balance of speed and transparency and inclusion. And it was difficult for them, but they still strove to do that. And so that's why I call it the paradox. The more they were transparent, the more they did balance processing, the more it helped them lead. And just being in crisis put a damper on those things. And so something that some of the leaders talked about was being transparent about what they could and couldn't share. And so that might look like, we're going to share with you, whatever it might be, our new policy on work from home, or our new policy on using your computer for personal use. And we can't yet tell you our rules on vaccination. Those are under development. But even just saying that was so important for the leaders. They also found that developing relationships, having those relationships in place on balance processing was really important. So some of these leaders had some pre-existing cross-functional teams. So maybe there was someone from legal, someone from sales, someone from HR. And when those were pre-existing networks, they were able to tap into them a little bit more quickly. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a flavor. You might enjoy some of the reading on crisis leadership. There's a lot of learning. I looked at some different crises, from 9/11 to a crisis in a hospital, to a train wreck, different crisis moments, and what tools leaders use for navigation, with communication being a real at the forefront.
Mhm. No, that's fantastic. I love what you said. And that's hard. Even the transparency part, it seems to me to be the hardest one, because, for example, in COVID, every week the information changes. So you
Yeah.
might think you are transparent, but everything can just change in one more day. And this puts leaders in a hard position. Yeah.
It does. And that goes back to the part of the study where the leader said saying we don't know became really important. And for some of them, it was really uncomfortable. I interviewed a a leader from HR, and she talked about kind of being trained as a leader to demonstrate confidence and to be all-knowing. But she found that saying, "I don't know," or "This is what I know now, and this may change, and I'll get back to you when it changes." So that type of a leadership fluidity and openness was really important.
Yeah.
I'm noticing the comment coming in from Carmen. I just want to acknowledge it. Yeah, vulnerability and self-awareness are very connected, very inseparable. And the leaders in my study, many of them discussed how leading during COVID, they were more vulnerable than they had ever been. And some of them talked about kind of the hidden gifts of COVID, and the things that were different that enabled them to be more vulnerable. So I can't tell you how many of the study participants talked about pets. I should mention I've got 3 doodles myself, Hank, Olive, and Indy. But these leaders said that for the first time in meeting with their teams, a pet might cross through the screen or someone might be off snoring in the corner, and then it became really important for them to lean in and recognize the more personal connections that they had with their teams. And by doing so, that helped them be more vulnerable. They were more human, and the people they were working with were more human, so it sort of enabled these connections. Yeah, definitely. Dr. Miramontes, do you want to comment on the resilience point? That's so important.
No, absolutely. And hearing you talk, a lot of what there's so much overlap, right? We talk so much at length about different components and when we talk about authentic leadership or even now inclusive leadership or all of these different approaches to leadership. But what I'm finding, especially as we're talking about resilience and crisis leadership and crisis management, is this idea that in order for us to bounce back, in order for us to be able to kind of reset, we have to be able to trust our leadership. And with that comes that vulnerability and that transparency, right? I love your point where you say, even acknowledging that you don't know. Like when I was in the nonprofit world, every year, I mean, funding is always like up in the air when it comes to the nonprofit world. But one of the things that I was very clear with my team was like, I will give you the information I have as I have it. But the caveat is it can change tomorrow. Like,
Yes.
So I will give you information and you need to afford me grace so that we can be in this kind of give and take relationship, because if it's all, no one's all knowing, no one's perfect. The ongoing joke used to be, I would sarcastically say, oh yeah, it's because I'm perfect, knowing full well, right, that that's the furthest from the truth. But this whole idea of being able to kind of bounce back, to kind of reset, has a lot to do with how much we trust, how much psychological safety exists, right? It's being able to say I was wrong and I'm sorry.
Yes.
And I
So
think
powerful.
sometimes that gets lost.
Those
So
are
I just
great
wanted
points.
to,
Yeah,
I just wanted to jump right in with that.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Does anyone else have another question? I do have a question, but it might change a little bit, shift a little bit the conversation.
Sure. Yes.
I love what you mentioned about snowballing related, the snowball cycle. And I will read it from another perspective. Okay, so you said that, leaders get better in self-awareness as they pass through the crisis. So another interpretation for that for me is, well, if leaders pass through crisis, they become better leaders. But we all have fears against crisis. And
Yes.
this is something that is kind of problematic because most of us, the first reaction is to really react, fight, fight against, and not learning with the new situation, the unknown situation.
Yeah.
So my first question is how do you deal with this fear of the change, the fear of change, as Carmen said there, And I would like you to explore more what you said about develop a culture of intentional risk taking, because it seems to me that it was the, you know, the key for maybe overcoming this challenging of fear of change.
Sure. Happy to talk about those. I'm going to actually put a couple of book recommendations in chat too, as backdrop for these. Forgive my spelling if I get these authors' names wrong, but I want to make sure you have these. Give me 1 second, and then I'll speak to this, and then I want to be sure to tackle the comment Jisoon in chat. I'm really eager to get to that. Okay, Saunders. These might be familiar to you, they might not, but I want to encourage your bookshelf growth. There's one. And then the other one I want to recommend is so the second one, new leadership literacies I have. So I teach organizational theory and human behavior and also organizational leadership. The second one I have in the syllabus for my organizational leadership class. The first one I have as optional reading for both. And so I really appreciate your question. And there can be fear. These are scary things. Leading in COVID was scary. And all of the leaders that I talked to, that I interviewed, spoke about fear and having fear. And the act of practicing leading through COVID helped them build their ability to lead in COVID. So a lot of times the answer of how do you navigate that fear is to have some practice of doing the thing, of leading. Now, how do we get to do that safely, right, is a question. And we don't have a global pandemic, thankfully, come along every day. But there are some ways to think about having practice and experience in sort of confronting those fears, if you will. One of those is simulation. So that was the recommendation that I had coming out of my study. Think about when we were in elementary school, and you know, I grew up in Los Angeles where we had earthquakes, and we would you know, drop under our desk and cover our necks, and we would practice. And then in 6th grade, I guess I'm dating myself now, when the Northridge quake hit, we all knew what to do, right? It was really early in the morning, so there wasn't a desk to jump over, but I sure knew to get to the door frame. The reason why I put Bob Johansson in here is he says that there are, in the new VUCA world, there are new leadership literacies to help carry us forward. One of them, he says, like simulations, comes from gaming. So his argument is that teenagers, kids, anyone who's playing video games is learning to tackle fear and scary scenarios and crisis, if you will, in a safe, fun entertainment setting. And so they're able to practice fear of whatever that video game is, and practice their actions as a game character, as a persona, and that they're able to translate then that courage, that ability to confront fear in a real world environment. So he actually advocates for lots of gaming. There's another book that I'll put in, Super Better. Jane McGonigal talks about gamification of everyday life. And so she encourages us to, please forgive my spelling. I want to say it's this, but I'm sure you'll be able to find it with a web search. She says that if we can tackle everyday challenges in our work as a quest, similar to this thinking of Johansson, that we'll fare better. So that's kind of step one of what you asked. You know, you also asked about risk-taking and innovation. And so I mentioned the Klein and Saunders book. I work in corporate learning and development. Anyone interested in education, in building learning organizations in the corporate world, government, nonprofit, this is a great book. And Klein and Saunders in chapter 4 say, we have to have a climate that celebrates failure, allows it, accepts it, encourages it, but celebrates failure, because the value of experimenting, of trying, of making mistakes, and then learning from it fuels innovation. That innovation can only come in an environment where maybe 9 things can be tried and they don't work, and then the 10th thing does, and it's a breakthrough, it's innovative. And so if we have an environment where there's intentional risk taking that is supported, encouraged, rewarded, not punished, that we have organizations that are learning organizations, but that are also more innovative. So lots of interesting spin-offs here. This could be maybe after, I don't know, Dr. Miramontes, Dr. Brahma, you could tell me, but once I've written a dissertation, I almost see the world as all the possible dissertations of things that could be written. And so there's something really interesting here around risk-taking, around innovation, and around agility. In my work, I employ a lot of lessons from Lean in agile project management, agile change management. I'll give you one more since I'm on just a book recommendation fury here, but I really like, and I've personally met and worked with Jason Little, and he writes about lean change management. And we talk about experimentation. How can we, change management, there you go. How can we have a feel of failure if we're not experimenting? And so we're used to more linear notions of change management. A lot of us are trained in pro-sci and ADKAR, and there's beginning, middle, and end to change. Lean change management says, let's gather insights, generate options, run experiments, and then scale the ones that work and drop the ones that don't and start all over again. But again, back to this point, Sue Ellen, that you raise, how do we get comfortable with that, with the fear? How do we encourage risk-taking and innovation if we have a culture of experimentation, of iteration, versus a more linear process? We probably have a better chance to do so. So thank you so much for that question. And there are some books. I did want to touch on Ji-Soon's point. Thank you, Ji-Soon. I'm going to say that sounds like a dissertation. So I personally looked at corporate leaders. That was the backdrop that I used. All of the leaders that I spoke with came from a corporate environment. In my recommendations for further research section, I said it would be really interesting to repeat this study. Parenthetical aside, it would be interesting to repeat this study now. Or in 5 years, what's changed, right? Because this was a very specific time during the pandemic. It would be interesting to repeat this study in healthcare with doctors and nurses as the participants. It would be interesting to repeat this study in academia. So I didn't list it there, Ji-Soon, but I thank you for this. I want to add to the list now. It would be interesting to repeat this study with spiritual leaders. And so before I call on Maria, Ji-Soon, I'm not sure the room you're in or if you're able to speak, but I wonder if you could say what you think about the answer to this question, or what might you hypothesize would be the similarities and the differences. There you are. Yeah.
Hi. Actually, the end of July, I am leading a session with the religious leaders in terms of self-awareness. So I really wanted to learn a lot from you, and I learned a lot today. So I will get in touch with you to get more, resources. I really appreciated your session today. In terms of leadership, I don't know if there are much difference. Mm-hmm. But then the expectation to the leaders is different, because the people who are looking to the leadership in the religious area, especially in the church, their expectation to their leaders is a lot different than the corporate leaders. Mm-hmm. And so that there is a lot of spiritual component at the same time. There are a lot more in depth of fear to the leaders, because, we are human, but the expectation from outside and from within is much heavier and much more serious than probably normal in a leadership setting. So that gives a lot of more stress, and it's hard to be vulnerable and hard to be transparent.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious to learn from your research. And so I'm so glad that we have this connection. It's fascinating. And so I look forward to hearing from you, and I'd love to read more about your study as well. So thank you.
Sure.
Sue Ellen, I'd love to hear from Maria before we wrap up, because I know she had her hand raised. And I just also want to express appreciation to you again, Maria. I'm so grateful for you.
It's so good to see you, and Dr. Brown, and I've missed you.
I missed you. I missed you.
Yeah, we spent so much time together there for a while.
We did.
Yeah, so it's really wonderful to see you again. You know, this the question that I have, it kind of follows Jisun's well in terms of the question of self-awareness. And I love the exercise that you had us do that kind of, oh my gosh, I was thinking, oh boy, I need to some of these things a little bit more. So my question is, when you got your scores from your husband and your friends, how did you set about processing that information? What did you do with that? Because that's, sort of, okay, now what?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Thank you for the question. By the way, I've got my book right here. I did this several years ago, and I go back to it. I go back to the findings here. I think everyone receives feedback differently. For me, I needed to first just receive it and take it in and see it as it was. Without my read on it. They're right, they're wrong, this is wonderful, this is terrible, minus the value add, or minus the kind of interpretation. I needed to just hear, what were they saying, kind of in a little bit of a distance removed way. It's nice that it's numbers versus words, in a way that helped me. So I needed to take it in, and I realized right away, even though I didn't necessarily feel gratitude in my heart, quite honestly, right at that moment, I needed to express gratitude to them. It was brave of them. It was vulnerable of them to share honestly with me. So I expressed gratitude to them. Then I went on just a bit of an exploratory journey with how interesting, or I'm curious, kind of with the researcher mindset. This number is different. Husband's number is 2 points lower than mine. Close friends see things exactly the same. That's interesting. And then for me, I really needed to write about it. So there were actually 2 different assignments I have. A great thing about this Global Leadership and Change program was lots of opportunity to look at our personal leadership. So I had 2 assignments, and I remember feeling nervous about it. And I think one of the professors, I said, do I have to upload this into Sakai, or can I just email you this? I really don't want anyone else to see this. But I got the psychological safety, and I wrote about it. I wrote about what I heard. I wrote about the blind spot. I wrote about what it might mean. And I used it as an ingredient into my own leader development plan. Where do I need to get better? I need to get better at some of these elements. I need to get better at understanding how aware I am of the impact I have on other people. I need to get better at being conscious of the moods that I might have and the emotions that I might have, and further to regulate those when I'm in particular contexts at work or at school and other places. So I went on a bit of a deep journey. For me, studying leadership and having a dissertation on leadership and teaching leadership theory, I cannot separate it from my own personal understanding of leadership and my own development journey as a leader. For me, it's very much a shared understanding. As I'm working with my students and learning about them and their leadership, that helps me learn about my own as well. So I'm curious to hear, I love staying in touch. Maria, maybe you'll let me know how it goes when you do your research.
Yeah.
And it's wonderful to discuss. I don't advocate for leadership development in a silo or a vacuum. We're all alone, but when we can support each other, that's really important.
Beautiful. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Brown. I know you have a hard stop right now, so I wanted to say thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your dissertation, and leading this wonderful, amazing conversation here. We all love to hear from you and discuss with you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be here. Good luck to everyone in your journeys. I would be curious to stay in touch. I'm on LinkedIn. I would love to connect on LinkedIn. If you send an invite, I'll accept it. And good luck to you in your research journeys of your own. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.